Good morning, and welcome back to the Morning Endurance Call. I'm Keith Erwood, and this is a free daily 15-minute or less leadership ritual for business owners, executives, and preparedness professionals who want to build stronger businesses, think more clearly under pressure, and lead with more clarity in uncertain times. Each weekday morning, we spend a few minutes talking about what it really takes to build stronger businesses, stronger leadership, and stronger preparedness in a world where disruption is part of reality. Today's topic is this: dependencies, the preparedness blind spot. This matters because one of the most common reasons businesses get surprised during disruption is not that they fail to identify a critical function. It is that they fail to understand what that function depends on. And that is a very important distinction. A lot of organizations do a decent job at identifying what matters: the critical processes, the key services, the important application, the essential team, the major customer-facing function. But identifying what matters is only part of preparedness. Because the next question is, what has to work for that function to actually work? That is where dependencies come in. A dependency is anything your business, process, service, or recovery effort relies on in order to function. That can include your people, your systems, applications, data, facilities, vendors, communications, power, internet, identity access, equipment, decision makers, third parties, and even specific pieces of information. In other words, dependency is often the unseen support structure behind the visible function. And that is why dependencies are such a blind spot, because organizations often focus on the obvious front-end function while underestimating the back-end conditions required to make that function possible. And when disruption happens, it is often those hidden supports that break first. That is why I often say dependencies are one of the most dangerous preparedness blind spots in business. Because when a dependency fails, the function that depends on it may fail too, even if that function itself looks fine on paper. That is the problem. A business may say, this application, we can recover this application, we can restore this process, and we can continue this service, and we have a plan for this function. But if they have not thought carefully about dependencies, the recovery or continuity assumption may be weaker than they realize. For example, you may be able to restore an application, but if users cannot authenticate, it is not truly usable. You may be able to bring a team online remotely, but if internet access is unstable, capability is reduced. You may have a manual workaround, but if a key person is unavailable, the workaround may not be viable. You may have a recovery environment, but if data synchronization was incomplete, the business consequence may still be serious. You may have a crisis communication process, but if the contact data is outdated, communication speed suffers immediately. That is what dependency failure looks like. And it is often what turns a manageable disruption into a much more damaging one. Now, one of the reasons dependencies get missed is because businesses often think in silos. Technology looks at technology, operations looks at operations, and finance looks at finance. Business units look at their own workflows, vendors are considered separately, and facilities are considered separately. But disruption does not respect those boundaries. disruption reveals interconnectedness. It shows what a process depends on. It shows that a process depends on a system. That system depends on network connectivity. That network depends on power and service providers. That process also depends on access permissions, trained people, accurate data, communication paths, and decision authority. And suddenly, what looked like one issue becomes a chain of issues. That is why understanding dependencies is not a technical detail, it is a leadership necessity. Because leaders need to understand where fragility lives inside the business. And fragility often lives in dependencies that are not being discussed clearly enough. This is one of the reasons I often say a function is only as reliable as the dependencies required to support it. That is a powerful preparedness truth. Now let's make this more practical. What are some of the major categories of dependencies that leaders should think about? First, people dependencies. Does a critical activity rely heavily on one person or a very small number of people? Is specialized knowledge concentrated too narrowly? Are there clear backups? Is there cross-training? Are key decisions dependent on one person being available? This is one of the most common blind spots in business. Second, there are technology dependencies. Does the process rely on a specific application, a specific database, interface, server, network path, or device? Can the process function if one of those pieces is unavailable? Is the recovery order actually aligned to the business dependency chain? Technology dependencies are often more layered than leaders assume. And third, data dependencies. Can the function still operate if data is unavailable, incomplete, stale, corrupted, or even inaccessible? How current does that data need to be? And what happens if it exists, but it can't be trusted? This matters because restored systems without trustworthy data may still create serious business problems. And fourth, vendor and third-party dependencies. How much does a critical process rely on an outside party? What happens if that vendor has its own outage, staffing issue, cyber event, or service delay? How much visibility or leverage do you really have? Many businesses are more exposed through third parties than they realize. And fifth, facility and infrastructure dependencies. Can this function still operate if a site is unavailable? What about power, cooling, physical access, transportation, or telecom disruptions? What physical conditions are quietly assumed to be present? And sixth, leadership and decision dependencies. This is one that gets overlooked often. Does the process depend on approvals, escalation decisions, or executive input before action can even occur? If so, how quickly can those decisions realistically happen under pressure? A process may be operationally ready, but still slowed significantly by decision dependency, and that matters too. Now, why is all of this so important? Because many organizations create preparedness plans around primary functions without fully understanding the dependency chain underneath them. And that leads to overconfidence. They believe they are ready because the function has been identified, the recovery target has been named, and the plan exists. But when the event happens, they discover that what they really planned for was only the visible layer, not the real operating conditions. That is why dependency thinking must be part of serious preparedness planning. This also connects strongly to business impact analysis. A BIA should not only identify critical functions, it should help surface what those functions depend on and what consequences emerge if those dependencies are disrupted. That makes the analysis more real, more useful, and more leadership relevant. And it also strengthens recovery strategy, because recovery is not just about bringing one thing back. It is about restoring enough of the dependency chain for the business to actually operate again in a useful way. That distinction matters. A system that is technically available but practically unusable has not really solved the business problem. And this is exactly where endurance comes in. Because endurance in business is the ability to continue operating, make sound decisions, and recover intelligently, and keep moving forward under pressure over time. Dependency awareness supports endurance because it helps leaders understand where the business is more fragile than it appears. If critical functions depend on weak, hidden, outdated or untested or even poorly understood supports, then the business is carrying more risk than leadership may realize. But when dependency chains are better understood, preparedness improves. Recovery becomes more credible. Testing becomes more useful. Risk discussions become sharper, and business impact becomes clearer. Also, leadership decisions become stronger. That is the value. Now, let's make this very practical for leaders. One of the best questions you can ask is this: what must be true for this critical function to actually work? That is a great dependency question. You can also ask, what people does it rely on? What systems does it rely on? What data does it rely on? What vendors does it rely on? What access does it rely on? What facilities or infrastructure does it rely on? And what approvals or leadership decisions does it rely on? Those questions reveal a lot, because most businesses do not usually fail from one isolated point. They struggle from breakdown across connected points. That is the dependency problem. And once you start seeing it, you start understanding the business more realistically. That is one of the reasons dependency mapping, cross-functional discussion, and practical exercises can be so valuable. They help reveal not just what matters, but what also makes what matters possible. That is the real work of preparedness. So here's today's leadership takeaway. Many businesses understand their critical functions better than they understand the dependencies that make those functions possible. And that gap creates hidden fragility. That is the point. And here's today's question for you. What critical function in your business looks stronger on paper than it would in reality if one of its key dependencies failed? That is a powerful question, because the answer often reveals one of the most valuable places to strengthen preparedness. Thank you for joining me today on the Morning Endurance Call. And if this kind of thinking is useful to you, consider joining our free endurance community. That is where I'm sharing additional resources, tools, live learnings, and ongoing conversations for business owners, executives, and practitioners who want to build stronger businesses through preparedness, leadership, and endurance. The link is below in the description. And tomorrow, I'll talk about how to think about maximum tolerable downtime. I also like to call it maximum allowable downtime, because knowing what matters is important, but knowing how long you can tolerate disruption is where consequences becomes very real. Until then, think clearly, prepare deliberately, and lead with endurance. Thanks for joining. Bye now.